Welcome to EKO201E Economics. I'm Chris Hannum, and this will be lecture 16 on measuring the cost of living. On the previous lecture, we introduced a concept when we talked about GDP, the difference between real and nominal GDP, called the Gdp Deflator, and how that could be used to calculate a rate of inflation. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about inflation in this lecture, but we're going to start by defining a different measure of prices called the Consumer Price Index. And we'll talk about how the Consumer Price Index is different but similar to the GDP deflator, then how one or the other could be used to compare different values, different prices over time to see whether they've actually risen or actually fallen relative to other goods. Now, what the Consumer Price Index is intended to measure is the prices that consumers specifically face. I mentioned that components of GDP include both consumption by households. They also include, say, government expenditures. They also include investment in fixed capital. They also include exports. But we're not really concerned for determining whether or not someone is better off or worse off for a given change in their income. We're not really so concerned with how much more expensive government purchases have become, or how much more expensive investment goods have become, because they don't purchase these kinds of goods. We're considering only the kinds of goods that households purchase for consumption purposes to create a measure of price and a measure of inflation that we would use to correct an individual's income for inflation. Because what this CPI measure of inflation or CPI measure of price is used for is things like indexation of pensions and wages, which we'll get to towards the end of this lecture. So how do we calculate this CPI? It's intended to represent the cost of living for an individual or for a household, and then to index that such that we can adjust the index over time rather than a monetary value. So the first thing that we need to do is, for an average typical person, fix a basket of goods that we say represents the consumption basket for the typical individual. This might contain 3 shirts. It might contain 100 kilowatt hours of electricity. It might contain 1/4 of one automobile. Again, they don't have to be full goods because this represents an average person. And if 1 in every 4 people purchase an automobile, the average person, the typical person, would purchase 1/4 of an automobile. So our bundle, our basket, includes a fixed quantity of a variety of different goods, where these are intended to be goods that the typical consumer purchases, not goods that the government purchases, not goods for export, not goods like tractors that aren't used for consumption, but rather for capital investment. The next thing we need to do is, for each of those goods, try to figure out how much they cost this time, at this period. So how much does the average automobile cost? How much does a kilowatt hour of electricity cost? How much does a shirt cost? And then we try to figure out, given those prices, what the total cost of this basket would be at this period of time right now. And we might find that, given all of the goods and services we've included in this basket, the average consumer's cost of living we calculate to be $24,203. Now, that's not quite the same as the CPI. In order to calculate the CPI, once we have a cost of the basket, we need to compare the cost of that basket now to the cost of that basket in some base year. Now, fundamentally, for calculating a CPI, it doesn't matter which year we assume is the base year. It could be any year. It could be 2000, 2010, 2013. Whichever year is the base year, it will be our year that is a reference point for comparison for other years. Then we would compare 2014 prices to 2013 prices, if 2013 was our base year. And we could also compare 2000 prices to 2013 prices, using 2013 as a base year, even though 2013 is in the future and 2000 is in the past. The next thing we want to do, once we've calculated that index value, is we want to calculate the change in that index value from year to year. Say the index has risen from 180 to 190, where in the first year, prices were 80% higher than in the base year, and in the second year, they were 90% higher than in the base year. But then, going from that CPI of 180 to a CPI of 190 would be a change in that CPI value of 10 percentage points. And then divide that to get a percentage change by that starting value of 180 CPI. If we take this to that previous example that we had from the previous example with a simple economy where we just purchase pizza and lattes, we have a price of 10, 11, and 12 in the 3 years for pizza, 2, 2.5, and 3 for the price of lattes in our economy. When we're calculating a CPI, in contrast to how we calculated GDP and therefore the GDP deflator, we have a fixed, constant basket of goods. So we assume that the typical household is going to buy a certain amount of pizza and a certain number of lattes, and that this will not change over time. We have to hold our basket constant in order to focus on the effect of the change in prices. So here we assume that the basket is going to include 4 pizzas and 10 lattes. So then in the base year, where our prices are 10 and 2, our total cost of the basket is 4 times 10 plus 2 times 10, 60. As we move forward from 2010 to 2011, and the price of pizza rises from 10 to 11, and the price of lattes rises from 2 to 2.5, the cost of our basket will rise, although the ingredients of the basket will not. It will include the same amount of pizza, and it will include the same amount of lattes. But now it's 11 times 4 for pizza total cost, and it will be 2.5 times 10 for total latte cost, giving us a total cost of the basket of 69. Again, although the ingredients in the basket, the goods and services in that consumption basket are constant. So then if the total cost of the basket is 60 in the base year, the base year CPI would be 100 times 60 divided by 60. And the CPI in the second year would be 100 times 69 over 60. And then the difference between those two, the percentage change in those two, is a 15% increase in the CPI. As the CPI increases from 100, which it must always be in the base year, to 115 in year 2. Now, that's a slightly different estimate, but a similar estimate that we got from the GDP deflator for the price changes, the aggregate price change, as we move forward 1 year from 2010 to 2011 in this small hypothetical latte pizza economy. Next, we want to present another example, similar example to the one with pizzas and lattes, with a simple two-good economy that's entirely unrealistic, because it will give us some additional insight into some issues that we might have with the CPI and how it calculates changes in price across the economy, how it calculates inflation. Suppose that the two goods that we have are on the one hand beef, and on the other hand chicken. Those are the only two goods in our economy. We can consume nothing else. And suppose that the basket includes 10 beef and 20 chicken. And the basket will be fixed every single year. Suppose in 2010, the price of beef is 4, then it rises to 5 in 2011, and then 9 in 2012. And the beef price rises dramatically. Suppose the price of chicken is initially 4, and then rises to 5 in 2011. So in 2010, the prices of beef and chicken are the same. In 2011, the prices of beef and chicken are the same. They both rise. And then in 2012, the price of chicken is 6. It rises by much less than the increase in price of beef. Okay, so what would CPI be in 2011? In order to calculate CPI in 2011, we need to determine what the cost of the basket is in 2011. The cost of the basket in 2011 will be 10 times 5 plus 20 times 5. 30 times 5, 150. Now, to see what the inflation rate is as we go from 2010 to 2011, we need to determine what the cost of that basket was in 2010. The cost of that basket in 2010 was 4 times 10, the price of beef, plus 4 times 20, the price of chicken, 120. So as we move from 2010 to 2011, both goods have increased in price by 25%, from 4 to 5, and the CPI has also increased 25%, from 120 to 150. We have an inflation rate of 25%. Now, next let's look at what the CPI is in 2012, and therefore what the inflation rate is between 2011 and 2012. Now, in 2012, the price of beef rises to 9, but in our basket, we continue to include 10 units of beef. So our beef cost in the basket becomes 9 times 10, 90. The price of chicken has risen from 5 to 6. We continue to consume the same amount of chicken, 20 units. So our total cost for chicken in our basket is 6 times 20, or 120. Add those two together, we get 210. The total cost of our basket in 2012 is 210. Now, in 2010, we would calculate the CPI as 120 divided by 120 times 100. In 2012, we would calculate the CPI as 100 times 210 divided by 120. As you can see, in 2012, the CPI has risen to 175 from 125 in 2011. If we calculate our inflation rate as we move from a CPI of 125 to 175 with a difference of 50, the percentage change is 50 divided by 125, our CPI value in 2011. For a CPI inflation rate, which may be different from what we would estimate using a GDP deflator, we'll get to this in a little bit, of 40%. Note that the increase in price of beef was much greater than 40% as we move from 2011 to 2012. But the increase in the price of chicken was much less than 40% as we move from 2011 to 2012. So the CPI price increase, the inflation rate that we calculate, is something of an average between those two goods, or a weighted average, where the weights come from the importance in our consumption basket. Before we use that example to explain something that we think might be wrong with the CPI, just briefly introduce what kinds of goods tend to show up in the CPI and in what proportions. In the United States CPI specifically, you can see that the largest share of any category of goods is housing. The average consumer spends 41% of their income on housing. So the CPI basket factors in 41% housing. And this is made up of things like rents for apartments. So by far the most important good in most people's lives that they need to spend their money on is rent or imputed rent if they own the house or apartment in which they live. Now, the second largest category, which is much smaller as a total share of the basket or a total share of their budget than housing, is transportation. That's the cost both of automobiles that they might purchase, also the cost of fuels used for those automobiles, the cost for rides and public transportation and taxis, all combined together into an aggregate good called transportation. The third category, coming close behind transportation at 15% in the United States economy, not necessarily in all economies around the world, is food and beverages, which includes both groceries, raw foodstuffs, things like bread or things like tomatoes, and also restaurant meals. Other categories of good make up much smaller portions of the average consumer's budget and also much smaller portions of the consumer's CPI basket used to calculate changes in their cost of living. This includes apparel, This includes recreation and also, somewhat counterintuitively, given that it's the American economy we're talking about, includes medical care. Whereas the share of the economy made up by medical care is huge, the share of the average consumer's budget of out-of-pocket medical expenses is not. This is because a lot of the total health spending in the United States isn't made by consumers. It's made by their employer in terms of a employer benefit of health insurance, or from the government in terms of government-funded health expenditures. The total share of all spending on all goods in the economy, so the total share of GDP in the US economy on medical care is more than 20%. But that's not represented in its share of the CPI basket. So we may have rapid increases in prices and costs of medical care that are not represented in rapid increases in the CPI. So they don't show up as much as maybe they should in American inflation rates. Now, to get back to our simple example of chicken and beef in a simple two-good economy, to explain these two goods, they're both meat. And as we mentioned many times before in this course, two goods which are similar are often substitutes. We could eat chicken or beef, but we wouldn't have any particular desire to eat chicken and beef together. And as a result, if the price of beef were to rise dramatically, we might be equally happy switching to chicken instead of beef, given that chicken and beef had previously had the same cost. But now chicken and beef have very different costs. Beef has become expensive while chicken has not. So a real household or a real consumer might be perfectly happy to substitute chicken for beef, but our basket includes fixed amounts of beef and chicken. So we assume that no substitution takes place. In the real world, some people would buy more chicken and less beef. Substitution would occur. Now, if we were to calculate the GDP deflator, in contrast, the GDP deflator doesn't use a fixed basket of goods like the CPI does. So the GDP deflator would allow the amount of chicken that we consume to rise, moving from one year to the next, and the amount of beef that we consume to fall, moving from one year to the next, as we choose to substitute. Of course, when we substitute out of beef, which is expensive, and into chicken, which is cheap, it isn't necessarily the case that we are equally happy with the chicken that we're now buying. We might be slightly less happy even though we choose to buy the cheap chicken instead of the expensive beef. We might have been happier with cheap beef than we now are with cheap chicken. So if we were to simply allow substitution to take place as it naturally does in the economy and allow our basket to adjust as we would with a GDP deflator, well then in that case, we might be overestimating the benefits to the economy of substitution. We might be minimizing the negative effects of this increase in relative price of beef. So we might be understating the effect of inflation, whereas the CPI might be overstating the inflation that we see in this particular scenario. As we can see in this simple example, if we calculate an inflation rate using an adjusted basket as we would for the GDP deflator, and that household basket adjusted from 10 and 20 to 5 and 25, as we see this change in the relative price of beef, this would lead our price index to rise only to 195 from 150. So our rate of increase in prices would be estimated at 30% instead of 40%. Again, this is much like what we would expect to see with the GDP deflator, whereas the CPI would give us a price increase inflation estimate of 40%. We refer to this basic problem with CPI, that the CPI has a fixed basket so it doesn't allow consumers to make any adjustments to substitute for relatively cheaper goods. We refer to this as substitution bias. And we would say that the CPI, because of the fixed basket, always overstates inflation. That is to say, we're not overstating the increase in prices. We may be overstating the negative impact on your well-being of the pricing increase that you saw. Now, that's not the only problem that we have with the CPI. There are a couple of other problems with the way the CPI calculates prices and inflation. One of which is that the CPI does not incorporate new goods. Now, it doesn't incorporate new goods because the basket is fixed at the base year. So if the base year was 2010, naturally the CPI basket can't include any goods that didn't exist in 2010. And moving forward in time, we might need to choose a new basket that includes all of these new products that have been introduced since our last basket was calculated. And over time, this is what governments do. We'll calculate CPI with a base year of 2000, and then in 2010, we'll recalculate a new basket with a new combination of goods that are available in 2010 and recalculate all of these inflation rates from the past 10 years as well as future years using that basket, the 2010 basket, as well as 2010 base year prices. This, of course, isn't a perfect correction because it requires us to wait many years in advance in order to recalculate what that inflation rate in, say, 2004 actually was. Whereas when we tried to calculate it in 2004, we calculated it using the year 2000 base year prices and base year basket. But the good introduced in 2003 wasn't included. Now, in addition to the fact that the failure to incorporate new goods makes the CPI inaccurate, the cost of living estimate inaccurate. We'd also say that when new goods are introduced and created, those new goods and the simple fact that they are there makes us all better off. And if that can't be incorporated in the CPI calculations, or the inflation rate calculation, this would be something that the CPI missed entirely. And again, the CPI might overstate the inflation rate or might overstate the negative impact on our welfare of these increasing prices. And the last issue with the CPI, say that the CPI is missing potentially unmeasured quality change in goods. Now, suppose that the reason that smartphones have become more expensive over time is because smartphones are higher quality. They have better features. They have more RAM. They have more memory. They have better screens, sharper screens, better color. Now, if smartphones are better, we would naturally expect them to be increasing in cost. It would cost more to make a better smartphone in the future, just like it costs more to make a better smartphone now. So what we see in the real economy is, say today we have 3 different types of smartphone: high quality, medium quality, low quality. And in the future, our 3 different types of smartphone are extremely high quality, something that didn't even exist before, high quality, and medium quality. Low quality smartphones don't exist at all. So the average smartphone that's being bought and sold in the market in the future, a few years down the road, is better than the average smartphone was in the past, on one hand, but we had in the past a price for the high quality smartphone, which is now in the future the medium quality smartphone. And that smartphone may cost less in the future than it did in the past. In effect, as our smartphones become better over time, we have a better product in the future that we should be willing to pay more for. It may be slightly more expensive as well, but the benefit to us could be so great from the improvement in quality that we would have been willing to pay even more than we have to pay. So in the future, we get more good in effect by getting a better good. And our basket that we're using assumes that the quality of the good stays exactly the same. The basket doesn't change along with the quality of the good. So all we can say by looking at the change in the cost of the basket is that there's been an increase in the cost of smartphone. If the reason that the smartphone is increased in price going forward into the future is an improvement in quality, it's not reflecting the basket that we're actually using. Say that to the extent that the CPI is not able to incorporate all of these changes in quality, although statisticians working for governments try to incorporate these changes in quality and deflate their CPI according to measurable changes in quality. Say, comparing high-quality smartphones in the future to high-quality smartphones now, rather than smartphones in the future in general to smartphones in general now. They try to incorporate these things and correct for these things, but they're never going to always be able to do that. And to the extent that they're not, again, the CPI will overstate inflation, or it will overstate the negative impact that inflation has on you. Because if the reason that prices are rising is that all of your goods are becoming better, you're paying more for them, but you're not necessarily any worse off. Each of these problems causes an estimate of CPI or an estimate of inflation based on CPI to overstate the true inflation rate or to overstate the negative impact of the true inflation rate. And statisticians working for the US government found that in the case of the US inflation rate, which is generally between 2–3%, or sometimes below 2% when the economy is not doing well, that the effects of these unmeasured quality change, new product introduction, etc., increase the inflation rate by about 0.5% above where they believe that it ought to be. They say that inflation rate calculated through CPI overstates the true negative impact of rising prices on people's welfare by about 0.5% a year. Now, next, we want to talk a little bit about the comparison between those two measures of inflation we've already introduced, the GDP deflator and CPI, and how they're different and how they're the same. You can see in the simple graph that the two do roughly track each other. It's, at least in the case of the United States, over recent economic history. When one rises, the other tends to rise as well. They both reflect the same changing prices. Now, there are key differences which you can see lead to sometimes big deviations in an inflation rate that you see from CPI and the inflation rate that you see from the GDP deflator. One example you can see on the graph is in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and that will be important in the distinction between how these two are calculated, what they include and what they don't. Now, to contrast the CPI basket versus the GDP deflator basket, first to point out, the CPI is intended to represent the cost of living for the average consumer, whatever it is that they buy, no matter where and when it was produced. So CPI does incorporate the cost of imported consumer goods, but the GDP deflator does not. The GDP deflator, because it's based on calculations of GDP, incorporates only the prices of goods that are produced in the country. Now, the big reason that we saw this jump in the CPI in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the United States was an increase in the cost of oil, which was imported into the United States. That big increase in the cost of imports raised CPI, but didn't raise the GDP deflator, again, because that was oil that was produced in other countries and imported into the United States. The CPI, because it's intended to represent the consumption bundle for the average household, it includes only consumption goods, but it doesn't include the cost of investment goods or the prices of investment goods, but GDP deflator does. The GDP deflator is intended to capture everything that makes up a component of GDP, whether it be a consumption expenditure, whether it be an investment expenditure or a government expenditure or an export. Now, these capital goods, something like an airplane or a tractor or a building, if they increase in price dramatically, would have an effect on the GDP deflator's inflation rate, but would not have any effect on the CPI's inflation rate. Other examples of goods which are not purchased by households, but rather purchased by businesses or government, might be in the United States, healthcare services. If the cost of health insurance in the United States rises dramatically, as it has been doing for the past few decades, but most of these expenditures come from businesses or they come from government, They don't come from households and they aren't part of the consumption bundle that fits into the CPI basket, that would lead to an increase in the GDP deflator, but not an increase in the CPI. So the GDP deflator would state a higher inflation rate than the CPI would if inflation is being driven by an increasing cost of health insurance. Next to point out, as I already have, to reiterate, the CPI uses a fixed basket which does not vary over time. As a result, there's no possibility for substitution when using the CPI to calculate inflation. On the other hand, the GDP deflator uses as a basket whatever it is that we produce in this country at this point in time. So the GDP deflator uses a variable basket that does allow for substitution over time due to changes in relative prices. I will try to illustrate this comparison between CPI and the GDP deflator by using a few simple examples. Suppose that the company Starbucks raises the price of a drink called a Frappuccino. Does this affect the CPI? Does it affect the GDP deflator? Now, a Frappuccino produced by Starbucks, supposing we're looking in the United States, is a good which is produced in the United States for consumption in the United States by households. So it's produced in the United States, so it factors into the GDP deflator. It's consumed by households in the United States, so it should be part of the basket representing the CPI. It should affect both measures of inflation. Suppose that what we're looking at is the company Caterpillar, which raises the price of industrial tractors that it produces, manufactured at a factory in Illinois. Again, we're looking at, does this have an effect on the GDP deflator inflation rate in the United States? Or does this have an effect on the CPI inflation rate in the United States? Now, industrial tractors which are produced by Caterpillar in Illinois, they are produced in Illinois, but they are an investment good. That should be incorporated in GDP because it's produced in the United States. However, it's an investment rather than consumption expenditure. That's the component of GDP that it's part of, the I rather than the C. As a result, it should factor into the GDP deflator's calculation of the inflation rate, and it shouldn't factor in to the CPI calculation of the inflation rate. So when Caterpillar raises the price of industrial tractors that they make, this causes an increase in the GDP deflator inflation rate. It does not have any impact on the CPI inflation rate because consumers don't buy these things. For our third example, suppose the company Armani, the clothing company Armani, raises the price of Italian jeans that it sells in the United States. Now, these are going to be consumed in the United States. They're going to be sold in the United States, and they're going to become more expensive. It should be part of the household consumption bundle. The basket makes up the CPI. So if it's a consumption expenditure by households in the United States, it should factor into CPI, and it should lead to CPI inflation. On the other hand, this is not a good that's produced in the United States. It's produced in Italy by an Italian company. And because it's not produced in the United States, it shouldn't affect US GDP, therefore shouldn't be part of the GDP deflator's basket. So it affects only the CPI inflation, but not the GDP deflator inflation. Now next, for one simple example for how we might take this inflation rate or this CPI calculation to actually put it to use other than by adjusting your pension over time or your wage over time along with raising prices, is to compare two prices that we see at different points in time. As an example, here the minimum wage in the United States in 1963 is $1.25, $1.25. And the minimum wage 50 years later, as of 2013, is $7.25. Obviously, $7.25 is much higher than $1.25. So we could say the minimum wage has risen, but we also know that in the United States, just like everywhere else in the world, prices are much higher in 2013 than they were in 1963. So if we have the same worker working the same kind of job 50 years later, earning the same minimum wage, is that worker better off in 2013? Or would that worker have been better off in 1963? We can determine this by looking at a real minimum wage, by correcting these values for inflation. Now, to find whether the 1963 minimum wage or the 2013 minimum wage had more buying power, what we would need is either to convert that 1963 minimum wage to 2013 dollars using the CPI, or to convert that 2013 minimum wage to 1963 dollars using the CPI. And the formula that we would use to calculate this, as you can see on the slide, is the amount in today's dollars would be equal to the amount in year T dollars, such as 1963 dollars, times the price level today divided by the price level in 1963, or year T. We'd say that $7.25 today, that amount in today's dollars, we could compare to that $1.25 in 1963 dollars times the price level today, the CPI in 2013, divided by the price level in year T, the CPI in 1963. Is $7.25 larger or smaller than $1.25 times the ratio between those CPIs? Now, if we've calculated that the CPI in the United States in 2013 is 234.6, whatever the base year might be, prices have risen from 100 to 234.6 over time, and that the cost of that bundle gave us a CPI in 1963 of only 30.9. Again, the base year is in between those two. So prices rose over time from 1963, and the CPI rose over time from 30.9 to 100, which it would have been in the base year. Now, then we would calculate the real value of that 1963 minimum wage of 1.25 in 2013 dollars as 1.25 times 234.6 divided by 30.9. We get in 2013 dollars, that 1963 minimum wage was equivalent to $9.49. So even though in 1963 a worker in the United States earning a minimum wage got only $1.25 per hour, they were able to buy more with that than a worker earning minimum wage of $7.25 is able to earn in 2013. The real buying power of the minimum wage has fallen over the past 50 years in the United States. We can see in a simple table here a calculation of a real minimum wage in the United States, or the United States minimum wage in current dollars as it adjusts over time from 1960 to 2013. That's calculated in $1970, in $1980, in $1990, etc. And you can see that it reaches a peak somewhere around 1970. And thereafter, it slowly adjusts downward. It falls as it is not adjusted but eaten away by inflation. Then it jumps up again as someone recalibrates that minimum wage before falling again. Because it doesn't rise every year, it rises only once every 5 years or 10 years. But the general trend since about 1970 has been downward in the United States in the minimum wage. Our next example for comparing costs over time won't look at a wage and the real wage at different points in time, but look at one specific price and see whether that price has risen faster or slower than the price of all other goods. And we would classify that as something like a real price. Now, the good in question that we want to look at is tuition at universities in the United States. Of course, İTÜ has no tuition. You don't need to pay anything to attend İTÜ. But for most universities in the United States, you must pay a substantial price in order to attend that university. The term for that price is tuition. The United States includes both private universities and public universities. And in public universities, the government generally funds some of the cost, but not all of the cost of education. As a result, the cost of attending a public university is lower than the cost of attending a private university. The tuition is lower. Also, public universities are divided into 4-year and 2-year programs. 2-year programs give you an associate's degree. They don't give you a full bachelor's degree. And they tend to provide technical education for specific fields. They teach people to do things like welding, or teach people to become dental assistants. Those programs tend to be more heavily subsidized by the government, and they tend to be cheaper as a result. Now, what we're going to compare here is the cost of attending these universities in 1990 as a single point in time, and in 2013 as another. We say the CPI in 1990 is 130.7, and the CPI in 2013 is 232.6. So then 232.6 divided by 130.7 is how much prices overall over that span have increased. Now, in the United States in 1990, the average cost of a public 4-year university per year was $1,908. And it rose into, in 2013, $8,893. So what we're going to do is to correct that $8,893, to correct it by converting it into $1990 to see how much the real tuition over time has risen. So if we convert the original cost in 1990 of a private education, private tuition for a private university in the United States, we convert it to $2013. We can do that by taking the tuition in 1990 and multiplying it by 232.6 divided by 130.7, just as we did in the example with the minimum wage. And we see that the equivalent in 2013 dollars for private university tuition was $16,622 instead of $9,340. Now, as we move to 2013, also measured in 2013 dollars, we see that the price of a private university tuition has risen to $30,094. So the real price of that private tuition, that is relative to all other prices in the economy, the cost of that private university tuition has risen by 81% from 1990 to 2013. It's a substantial increase in the cost of attending a private university in the United States. However, if we compare that to the change in the cost, the real cost of attending a public university, which was and remains cheaper than a private university, the cost of attending the public university in 1990, when we adjusted into 2013 dollars, was $3,396 instead of $1,908. But we already established it has risen in cost to $8,893 by 2013. And the inflation that we've seen in that product category from 2013, going back to 1990, has been 161.9%. So public university tuition has increased twice as fast as private university tuition has, even though both public and private university tuition have increased in price much more than other goods around the economy have. If we were to perform the same calculation for a variety of different specific prices for specific goods in the economy, we would find that for some goods, their real price has decreased since 1990. One example would be automobiles or computers. See, their price has increased over time, but has increased more slowly than the price of other goods has. So the real price has decreased. And our correction here for the rate of inflation would give us a negative percentage change over time. In the United States, the most important types of goods that have increased in price much more rapidly than prices in general have been, as mentioned, education and also healthcare. We've mentioned that the CPI, inflation rate based on the CPI, things like that, they could be used to correct things like minimum wage from 1963 to see what it would be in 2013 dollars. But there are other variables we might like to correct for inflation as well, strip out that impact of inflation. And one of those is a nominal interest rate. So a nominal interest rate, this is just the interest rate that you see. If you take out a loan from a bank and the bank expects you to pay 20% per year in interest on that loan, that's a nominal interest rate, and that is the relevant interest rate for you personally. That's the amount that you have to pay back. But that's not the relevant interest rate that we would often want to consider for policy-making purposes, or for long-term investment planning, or rate of return for long-run investment planning. We would want to factor in the fact that it, as well as needing to pay more than the original amount that we borrowed from the bank, the money that we've borrowed from the bank right now could be used to buy some kind of an asset that might increase in price along with inflation. So, if we were to borrow money and pay a 20% interest rate, but we could get actually a 25% return on that money that we borrowed simply by waiting for prices to rise 25% on the assets that we're holding, or the things that we own, then for our purposes, that interest rate is negative. We would be considering what we call a real interest rate, which is simply a nominal interest rate, the headline interest rate that you actually see, minus the rate of inflation. That real interest rate is the interest rate that should be factored in when making many types of long-term investment decision, and also the interest rate that should be taken into account by government policymakers who are attempting to target a particular interest rate as being desirable or undesirable for the economy. Look at not how high the interest rate is, not how high the nominal interest rate is, but rather how high the real interest rate is. So suppose, as another simple example, suppose hypothetically you deposited an amount in the bank, as opposed to a loan. Say you deposit some money in the bank, you save it there, and you expect to be paid an interest rate by that bank. Suppose that the interest rate that they pay you is 9% on that savings account in that bank. That's a nominal interest rate. They pay you 9%, so you would expect after 1 year to have 1,000 plus 1,000 times 9%, or $1,090 in the bank. However, during that year, while your money sits in the bank unspent and unused, prices rise. Prices rise by 3.5%. So that 1,090 that you have after a year isn't able to buy you as much as 1,090 would have a year before. How much more can you buy? Well, to determine how much more you could buy after receiving a 9% nominal interest rate, we would need to correct that 9% nominal interest rate for inflation. That real interest rate would be 9% minus 3.5%. Let's say that the money that you get after a year would enable you to spend 5.5%, the real interest rate, more than you originally could before you saved that money and before you earned that return.